I came back to the mountain because I had no choice. For 37 years, I lived in the valley below, working construction jobs, raising children who spoke only English, watching the old ways dissolve like morning mist under a harsh sun. But the dreams started 6 months ago, and they came every night without fail, growing stronger until I could barely distinguish sleeping from waking. In those dreams, I heard a voice calling my name through corridors of ancient cedar and Douglas fir, a voice that seemed to rise from the earth itself, vibrating through root systems that stretched back before memory. It wasn't words exactly, more like a summoning that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to something buried in my bones. My wife said I would wake up speaking in tongues, syllables she didn't recognize, and she would find me standing at the window facing north toward the peaks where I was born. The doctors had no explanation, offered pills I never took, suggested stress and the weight of approaching old age. But I knew better. This was the mountain claiming what belonged to it, pulling me back to a territory my grandfather had made me promise never to forget, even as the world around us insisted we should. So I packed my truck with camping gear, told my family I needed time alone, and drove up the logging roads until they disappeared into game trails, following a map drawn not on paper but inside my chest, where grief and duty had always lived side by side. The sacred grove looked smaller than I remembered, but then again, I had been a boy of 12 the last time I stood here with my grandfather's weathered hand resting on my shoulder. He had brought me to this exact spot where 7 cedar trees grew in a perfect circle around a natural spring that never froze even in the deepest winter, and he had spoken words I was too young to fully comprehend. Words about guardianship and old promises, about beings that walked these forests long before our people arrived and would remain long after we were gone. I had dismissed it as the rambling of an old man, too attached to stories, eager to return to the valley and its electric lights and possibilities. Now, standing here again with silver threading through my own hair, I felt the weight of what I had abandoned pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. I set up my tent at the edge of the circle, my hands remembering the motions my grandfather had taught me even as my conscious mind had tried to forget. That first night I sat by a small fire and attempted the cleansing rituals from childhood, fumbling through half-remembered gestures and whispered phrases in a language I had spent decades trying to bury. The words felt clumsy in my mouth, like stones I had to force past my teeth. But somewhere deep in the forest, I swear something was listening. The second night was quieter, and I began to doubt myself, wondering if I had driven into these mountains, chasing nothing but the phantoms of guilt and advancing age. I performed the rituals again, more confidently this time, letting muscle memory guide what conscious thought could not fully reconstruct. The fire burned steady, and the spring water tasted exactly as I remembered. Mineral-rich and cold enough to make my teeth ache. I slept fitfully, dreaming of my grandfather's face as it had looked the last time I saw him. Disappointment etched deep around his eyes when I told him I wouldn't be coming back, that I had found work in the city and a life that made sense in the modern world. In the dream, he didn't speak, just pointed toward the darkness between the trees where something massive moved just beyond the reach of firelight. I woke before dawn with my heart hammering, uncertain whether the sound of footsteps I heard was part of the dream or something moving through the pre-dawn shadows. The grove was silent, except for the whisper of wind through cedar branches, but the air felt different, charged with an anticipation I couldn't name. On the third night, everything changed, and I understood with terrible clarity that I had never been coming home to find peace, but to answer for abandonment and to face a truth my bloodline had been running from for generations. The dreams had not been warnings, but invitations, and I had finally arrived at the threshold of something far older and more patient than human shame. I built the fire as darkness gathered, speaking the ritual words with greater precision, feeling them resonate in ways that bypassed meaning and went straight to purpose. And as the last syllable left my lips, I heard it, unmistakable and impossible to dismiss as imagination. The sound of footsteps, massive and deliberate, circling the grove just beyond the firelight's reach, and with them came a smell so overwhelming and primal that every cell in my body suddenly remembered what it meant to be prey. The musk hit me first, before my mind could even process what my eyes were seeing, a scent so thick and ancient it seemed to coat the inside of my throat with each breath. It was earth, an animal, and something else, something that smelled like time itself, like caves that had never seen daylight and forests that predated human footsteps. My grandfather had tried to describe this smell once, struggling for words in both English and our native tongue before finally giving up and simply saying that some things could only be known through direct experience, that some truths lived in the body's memory rather than the mind's filing system. The footsteps had stopped, and in the sudden silence that followed, I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat thundering against my ribs, of the way my hands had begun to tremble despite decades of telling myself I didn't believe in the old stories anymore. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling upward into darkness, and in that brief illumination, I saw movement at the edge of the grove, something tall enough that it seemed to merge with the cedar trunks themselves, using shadow and stillness as camouflage in a way that spoke of intelligence rather than animal instinct. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, neither of us moved, predator and prey locked, in an ancient calculation that transcended thought. Then it stepped forward, crossing from shadow into the amber circle of firelight, and every childhood story I had dismissed as superstition suddenly became undeniable reality, standing 8 feet tall before me. The creature was massive, broad-shouldered and covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the scars that told the real story, crisscrossing its torso and arms like a map of countless years and unknown battles. This was no shy forest dweller glimpsed at a distance by startled hikers, no blurry photograph that could be explained away as bear or shadow or wishful thinking. This was a being that radiated age and purpose, whose eyes reflected the firelight with an intelligence that made my breath catch in my chest. Those eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like being seen all the way down to my ancestral DNA, past the decades of assimilation and forgetting, past the construction jobs and mortgage payments, straight through to whatever remained of the boy who had once sat in this grove and listened to impossible stories. I wanted to run, every modern instinct in my body screaming at me to flee, but something deeper held me frozen, a recognition that bypassed fear and touched something I didn't have words for in any language. The creature's mouth opened, and I braced myself for a roar or growl, some sound that would match its terrifying physicality. Instead, what emerged was a voice, deep and layered like wind, moving through canyon systems, carrying harmonics that seemed to vibrate in my chest cavity and skull simultaneously. And impossibly devastatingly, it spoke in words I recognized from childhood. Syllables my grandfather had whispered during ceremonies I had been too young and too eager to leave behind to fully appreciate. The language of my people, or something older that my people had borrowed from, words I hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 30 years and had convinced myself I'd forgotten. But my body remembered, even as my conscious mind struggled to translate, some part of me understanding at a level beneath language that this was greeting and challenge and question all woven together. The creature spoke slowly, watching me with those unnervingly intelligent eyes, and I realized with a shock that cut through my fear that it was waiting for a response, that this was not a chance encounter but a deliberate meeting, that everything, the dreams, the pull back to these mountains, the rituals I had performed, had been leading to this moment of contact between worlds that were never meant to fully separate. I found my voice, though it came out smaller and more fragile than I intended, and I responded in the broken fragments of my native tongue that remained accessible, apologizing even as I spoke for how much I had forgotten, how much had been allowed to slip away. The creature tilted its head slightly, an almost human gesture of consideration, and when it spoke again, the words came slower, simpler, as if adjusting its language for a student who had missed too many lessons. And in that adjustment, in that accommodation, I understood something that shook me more deeply than fear ever could. This being wasn't just intelligent, it was a teacher, a keeper of knowledge, and I was being given an opportunity that my grandfather had died, hoping I would one day be ready to receive. The firelight danced between us, creating shifting patterns on the creature's scarred hide, and I saw what I had missed in my initial terror. Symbols worked into some of those scars, deliberate markings that looked ceremonial rather than accidental, a written language carved into living flesh. This was no simple forest animal, elevated by human imagination into legend. This was something that carried its own history, its own purpose, its own devastating patience as it waited for humans to remember what we had promised, and then abandoned. The creature moved around the perimeter of my camp with a deliberateness that spoke of ritual rather than threat, each footfall placed with such precision that despite its massive weight, it made less noise than I did simply sitting and breathing by the fire. I watched, transfixed, as it paused at each of the 4 directions, lowering its head in what looked unmistakably like acknowledgement or prayer, and I realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air that it was recognizing the boundaries I had traced earlier with cornmeal and tobacco. The half-remembered ceremony my grandfather had performed in this exact spot decades ago. The creature wasn't inspecting my camp, it was honoring it, completing the ritual I had begun with only partial understanding, filling in the gaps in my broken memory with movements so ancient they seemed written into the landscape itself. When it returned to face me across the fire, something had shifted in the air between us, a barrier crossed or perhaps rebuilt, and I understood that the ceremony had been a test I hadn't even known I was taking, that my clumsy attempt at the old ways had been enough to open a door that might otherwise have remained forever closed. The musk that surrounded the creature intensified as it settled into a crouch, folding its enormous frame with surprising grace until we were almost at eye level, separated by perhaps 10 feet and a gulf of forgotten knowledge that suddenly felt both impossibly wide and terrifyingly narrow. Up close, I could see that the ceremonial scars weren't random markings, but a language I should have been able to read, symbols that tugged at something buried in my cellular memory, each one a word or concept that my ancestors had understood as naturally as breathing. The creature's eyes never left mine as it reached one massive hand toward the fire, not into it, but beside it, gathering a palm full of ash and earth that it brought to its chest, pressing the mixture over its heart in a gesture I had seen my grandfather perform during mourning ceremonies. My throat tightened as understanding crashed over me. This being was grieving, had been grieving perhaps for generations, watching the connection between our peoples fray and break, while it waited with impossible patience for someone to remember, someone to return, someone to hear. I found myself mirroring the gesture without conscious thought, my own hand gathering ash and earth, pressing it over my own heart, and when I did, the creature's eyes closed briefly in what looked heartbreakingly like relief. When it spoke again, the words came with images that bloomed in my mind, like memories that weren't my own, visions of these mountains when they were younger, when the forests grew denser and the rivers ran clearer, when my people walked these paths with the confidence of those who understood their place in a larger pattern. I saw gatherings in this grove where men and women in traditional dress met with creatures like the one before me, exchanges happening that looked like trade or treaty, objects passed between species with the solemnity of sacred obligation. The vision shifted, showing the same grove but emptier, Fewer humans coming to the meetings, then none at all, the creatures waiting season after season, in a clearing that remained empty, except for their patient vigil. The images came faster now, showing the mountains beginning to sicken in ways that went deeper than logging or development, a wrongness spreading through the roots and soil and waterways, as if the land itself was dying from broken promises, from agreements abandoned and oaths forgotten. I gasped as the vision released me, tears streaming down my face, though I couldn't have said exactly what I was crying for, whether for the loss of knowledge or the weight of responsibility or simply the devastating beauty of connection restored after decades of silence. The creature leaned forward, and I forced myself not to flinch as one massive hand extended toward me, palm up in a gesture of offering or perhaps request. And I understood with crystalline clarity that this moment was a threshold, that what happened next would determine not just my own path, but something larger, older, more important than my individual fear or comfort. The scent of musk and earth and ancient. A purpose surrounded me completely now, no longer threatening but almost protective, like being embraced by the mountain itself, and I felt something in my chest crack open that had been sealed shut since childhood. Since the day I decided the old ways were embarrassing relics rather than living wisdom. My hand moved toward the creatures, outstretched palm seemingly of its own accord, trembling but determined, and in the heartbeat before contact, I sent up a prayer to my grandfather's spirit, hoping that wherever he was watching from, he could see that his stories had finally found fertile ground in soil I had thought was barren, that the seeds he planted were blooming at last. Despite the long winter of my forgetting, the moment our palms touched, something passed between us that wasn't physical contact, but recognition on a level I had no vocabulary to describe, as if every ancestor in my bloodline suddenly awakened in my bones, whispering, "Yes, this is what we were, this is what you forgot, this is what you must remember." The creature's hand was warm despite the cold night air, textured like ancient bark, and where our skin met, I felt a vibration that might have been a heartbeat or might have been the mountain's pulse, some rhythm that had been playing beneath everything all along, inaudible until this precise moment of connection. Images flooded through. Me again, but different this time, more intimate. Memories that belonged to this specific being, scenes of it watching my family across generations, recognizing the markings of bridge keepers in the way we walked, the prayers we spoke, the attention we paid to boundaries and thresholds that others crossed without noticing. I saw myself as a child through its eyes, following my grandfather through these woods, absorbing lessons I thought I'd forgotten, and I realized with a shock that tasted like lightning that this creature had been present for those teachings, observing from distances I never perceived, waiting to see if the knowledge would take root or wither, as it had in so many others before me. The creature's other hand rose slowly, giving me time to refuse or retreat, but I held steady as those massive fingers touched my forehead with surprising gentleness, and suddenly I could feel what it was feeling, a loneliness so vast and ancient it made my own decades of urban isolation seem like a moment's distraction. I understood then that these beings were not solitary by nature but by necessity, that they had once lived in communion not just with their own kind, but with humans who served as translators and witnesses, and that the breaking of that bond had left them stranded in a silence more complete than any human could comprehend. Through our contact, I felt its memories of waiting, season after season, year after year, decade after decade, maintaining the vigils and protections that the old agreements required, even as the human half of that contract vanished into assimilation and forgetting. The grief was overwhelming, but beneath it ran something fiercer, a determination that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with duty, a refusal to abandon responsibility, even when abandoned by those who should have shared the burden. My own hand rose to mirror the gesture, fingers touching the scarred patterns on its forehead, and I felt rather than heard its deep exhalation, a breath that seemed to release centuries of held tension. Words began, forming in my mind, not English or even the reservation language of my childhood, but something older, syllables that felt sharp and precise as surgical tools, each one carrying meanings that would take paragraphs to explain in modern speech. The creature was teaching me, not through explanation but through direct transmission, planting the ancient vocabulary in the same place my grandfather's stories had taken root. And I realized that language itself was the bridge we were rebuilding, that every word I learned was a plank laid across the chasm that had opened between our peoples. I found myself speaking the words aloud as they came, my voice sounding strange and resonant in ways I didn't recognize, and with each syllable the air around us seemed to thicken and brighten, as if reality itself was listening and responding to sounds it hadn't heard in far too long. The creature's eyes reflected the firelight with an intensity that was almost joy, and I understood that this was the first time in perhaps 50 years that anyone had spoken these words correctly, with intention and understanding, completing circuits of meaning that had been left open and sparking in the dark. When it finally withdrew its hand from my forehead, I swayed with sudden vertigo, my mind crowded with knowledge I didn't yet know how to organize, words and concepts and responsibilities tumbling over each other in a cascade that felt both like drowning and like finally learning to breathe. The creature stood slowly, rising to its full towering height, but the movement felt less like intimidation now, and more like invitation, a gesture asking me to see the true scale of what we were part of, the vast living system that required bridge keepers to function properly. It turned toward the darkness beyond the firelight, then looked back at me with an expression I could only call expectant, and I knew with absolute certainty that the teaching had just begun, that this night was merely the opening of a door I would spend whatever remained of my life learning to walk through. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, words he'd spoken when I was too young to understand. Some doors only open once in a generation, and you'll know it's your door because walking through will feel like coming home and leaving home at the same time. Standing there with ash still pressed over my heart and ancient words buzzing in my skull, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The creature's voice, when it truly spoke rather than transmitted thoughts, was unlike anything I had imagined possible, a sound that seemed to originate from multiple sources simultaneously, as if the wind itself had learned to form consonants, as if the mountain had found a throat. It rolled through the clearing in waves that I felt in my chest cavity before my ears registered them as words, each syllable carrying harmonics that suggested meanings within meanings, layers of significance that my newly awakened linguistic understanding struggled to pass. The language was the one my grandfather had whispered in sacred moments, the vocabulary the missionaries had tried to erase, but hearing it from this being's mouth revealed how incomplete my childhood lessons had been, how much we had already lost, even when the elders thought they were preserving everything. The creature spoke of names, not labels, but true names, the kind that contained the essence of what they described. And as each word left its mouth, I saw corresponding images in my mind. Specific trees that served as anchors, particular stones that held boundaries, springs whose waters carried something more than minerals. I realized with creeping horror that I was being taught a map, not of physical terrain, but of sacred architecture, and that this map existed nowhere else, but in the minds of those who could speak and understand these increasingly extinct words. Every elder who died monolingual in English took portions of this map into the grave, leaving gaps like missing teeth in a mouth that could no longer properly form the words that kept everything intact. Speaks between thresholds, the creature said, and I knew somehow that it was naming me, or rather naming what I was supposed to become. using a designation that my bloodline had carried before surnames and census records stripped such titles away into the forgotten places. The name felt like a weight settling onto my shoulders, not oppressive but substantial, the way a ceremonial cloak might feel. When placed on someone being initiated into responsibilities they hadn't asked for, but couldn't honorably refuse. The creature continued speaking, its voice dropping into registers that I felt more than heard, explaining how my grandfather had been the last fluent speaker of the binding words, the final human who could pronounce the agreements, clearly enough to maintain their power. I saw then what had happened in my grandfather's final years, the desperate attempts to teach me that I'd resisted in my teenage arrogance, my modern educated certainty that these old ways were superstition and nostalgia, primitive thinking that had no place in the world I was rushing toward. The creature's eyes held no judgment as these memories surfaced between us, but I felt the crushing weight of my own failure nonetheless, understanding now what my grandfather had been trying to prevent, why he'd grown increasingly frantic as his health deteriorated, and I remained stubbornly monolingual in my thinking. The being's next words cut through my self-recrimination like a blade through smoke. The past cannot be rewritten, but the present remains unfinished, and I was here now, which meant the story hadn't ended in the way everyone, including itself, had feared it would. The darkness your kind cannot see, it continued, switching between the old tongue and something even older, a language that predated human speech entirely, though somehow I understood it through means that bypassed my ears entirely. What it showed me then made my earlier visions seem like pleasant dreams. I saw the mountains not as solid matter, but as living tissue, and throughout that tissue spread something like infection, a spreading absence that consumed not just physical substance but meaning itself, possibility itself, turning places of power into voids where nothing could take root or grow. This was what happened when agreements dissolved, when the words that bound protection into place went unspoken for too long, when the bridge keepers vanished and left the gates unattended. I watched human developments spread across the vision like crystallizing poison, not because buildings and roads were inherently corrupt, but because they were placed without regard for the architecture underneath, the invisible structures that humans had once known how to navigate and honor, shopping centers built over springs that were supposed to remain open to the sky, highways cutting through songlines that required unbroken continuity, drilling and extraction in places where certain stones were supposed to remain undisturbed forever, each violation small in itself, but accumulating into a cascade of broken circuits and severed connections. The creature's voice carried a weariness that transcended physical exhaustion, as it explained how its kind had tried to maintain the protections alone, but the words required human voices to speak them, human intention to activate them, and without that partnership, the best they could do was slow the spread rather than stop it. 3 generations, it said, and I knew it meant 3 generations since the last proper bridgekeeper had functioned in full capacity, 3 generations of increasing silence and accumulating breakage. My grandfather's face flashed through my memory as the creature spoke of guardians, but now I saw him differently, not as the old man in the vinyl chair on the reservation, but as he must have been in his prime, standing, in clearings like this one, speaking words that held mountains together. The Bigfoot's revelation about its kind being watchers and protectors explained so many fragments from my childhood that I dismissed as colorful mythology. The stories about the tall ones who walked between worlds, the warnings about certain valleys where humans shouldn't linger after dark, the offerings left at tree lines that always disappeared by morning. These weren't cautionary tales meant to keep children from wandering. They were operational instructions for maintaining a relationship that predated the arrival of Europeans by thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands. The creature gestured toward the darkness beyond our firelit circle, and somehow I understood that we were surrounded by others of its kind. A council of ancients who had gathered because my presence here represented the first possibility of renewed contact in longer than I could comprehend. They had been waiting, watching bloodlines thin and fragment, hoping that someone from the Bridgekeeper families would eventually find their way back to the old places, with enough of the knowledge intact to rebuild what had been broken. "We are not what your new stories claim," the Bigfoot said, its voice carrying something that might have been bitter amusement. "Not animals to be proven or disproven, not creatures for your cameras." And plaster casts. As it spoke, I saw overlapping images of its kind through different eras, standing with humans in ceremonies that left no archaeological trace because they involved nothing material, only spoken agreements and witnessed promises. I saw them during the time of the Great Dying, when diseases brought by ships devastated human populations, how they had tried to maintain the boundary protections alone, but found the words losing power without human voices to complete the circuit. I witnessed their grief as languages vanished, as the last speakers of dozens of tribal tongues died without passing on the crucial vocabulary, leaving gaps in the protective network that began spreading like breaks in a dam. The creature showed me how its kind had adapted their guardianship in desperation, taking on burdens that were never meant to be theirs alone, speaking approximations of the binding words that grew less effective with each passing generation. They had become shadows of what they were supposed to be, forced into, hiding not primarily from human violence, but from the simple fact that without the partnership, their presence became increasingly dangerous to both sides of the boundary they were meant to maintain. The being reached toward me then, not physically, but with intention that manifested as pressure against my chest, and I felt something unlock inside. My ribcage, a sensation like a door opening in a room I hadn't known existed within my own body. Memories flooded through that opening, but they weren't mine. They were ancestral, carried somehow in blood or bone, experiences of my grandfather and his grandfather and the long chain of bridgekeepers stretching back before memory became history. I saw through their eyes as they performed the duties I was being asked to assume, walking boundary lines while speaking words that made the air crystallize into barrier, standing at thresholds between human settlements and wild places to facilitate communications that kept both sides safe, serving as translators for agreements between forms of consciousness so different that without intermediaries, they could barely perceive each other as real. The knowledge came with muscle memory my muscles had never learned, with pronunciation guides written into genetic code, with understanding of ecological relationships that modern science was only beginning to suspect existed, but it also came with the cost clearly visible. Every bridgekeeper eventually faced the choice between maintaining their human life with its normal span and relationships, or binding themselves so completely to the work that they became something other, neither fully human nor fully part of the wilderness, walking a middle path that demanded everything. "Your grandfather chose his family," the creature said softly, and I understood that this wasn't judgment but explanation. He had performed the duties as much as he could while remaining primarily human, training his children in fragments, hoping one of them would be able to carry it forward without making the full sacrifice. My father had refused, entirely fleeing into alcohol and urban anonymity, leaving me as the last possibility, the final thread of a bloodline that had once been robust with knowledge carriers. The Bigfoot's scarred face showed millennia of similar disappointments and occasional triumphs, partnerships that had flourished and then faded, the endless, patient work of maintaining protections that humans benefited from without knowing they existed. I realized the creature was showing me what guardianship truly meant, not glory or recognition, but the daily choice to hold boundaries that no one would thank you for, to speak words that prevented disasters people would never know had been threatening, to sacrifice. personal desires for collective survival that would go uncelebrated and unremembered, except in the oldest stories that fewer and fewer people believed anymore. The creature's next words came slower, weighted with a reluctance that made the air between us feel dense and harder to breathe. "The forgetting did not happen by accident alone," it said. And something in that statement made my stomach drop before I fully understood why. Through the connection still pulsing between us, images began forming of the early reservation years, the boarding schools, but also something more insidious. My own ancestors making choices, deliberate choices, to withhold the teachings. I saw a gathering of elders from multiple tribes in the late 1800s, my great-great-grandfather among them, debating in urgent whispers whether the old agreements should be maintained or allowed to fade. Some argued that the white man's world was coming regardless, that teaching children to speak with forest guardians would only mark them as mad or savage in the new reality, being forced upon them. Others insisted the duties transcended politics and survival, that abandoning the pacts would have consequences beyond human concerns. The debate had grown heated, then bitter, and finally fractured, with some families choosing silence as protection for their children, wrapping the knowledge in layers of metaphor and symbolism until even they forgot what was literal instruction and what was merely story. My own bloodline had been among those who chose strategic forgetting, and the creature was showing me that this choice, made from love and fear, had been a key break in the dam. "We do not blame them," the Bigfoot continued, though its voice carried textures of grief that suggested feelings more complex than forgiveness. "But understanding why the words were lost does not restore them, and the barriers have grown so thin that even our kind can barely perceive them anymore." It gestured again toward the darkness, where I felt rather than saw the gathered council of ancients, and suddenly I understood. What it hadn't directly stated, they were dying, not all at once, but fading year by year as the agreements that sustained their form of existence weakened without renewal. The creatures weren't precisely physical in the way humans understood solidity. They were consciousness given shape through the partnership, through the spoken words that acknowledged them and defined their purpose. Without human voices completing the circuit of recognition and agreement, they were becoming less real, slipping back toward whatever realm they had originally been called from when the first pacts were made. The extinction facing them was metaphysical, an unbecoming that would leave no bodies to prove. They had existed, only an absence that humans would fill with other predators and other fears, never knowing what had actually been lost. And with their fading, the boundaries they maintained would collapse entirely, releasing things that the forest guardians had been holding back since before human memory began keeping records. The creature moved, closer now, and I could see that its scars weren't from battles or accidents, but from holding barriers that should have been reinforced with spoken words, from physically manifesting to block incursions that should have been prevented through maintained agreements. Each mark on its ancient body represented a failure of human partnership, a moment when it had thrown itself against forces that speech should have deflected, paying in its own substance for human forgetting. What comes through if we fail is not evil by its own measure, the Bigfoot explained, but it does not distinguish between types of consciousness, does not recognize human settlements as different from ant-hill colonies or salmon's spawning grounds. I saw flashes of what it meant, vast presences that moved through matter the way wind moved through trees, reshaping everything in their path according to patterns that served purposes incomprehensible to human minds. They weren't malicious, but they would unmake the world I knew simply because nothing existed to remind them that this world was currently occupied in ways that the remaking would extinguish. The agreements my ancestors had established weren't conquering or controlling these forces. They were asking, negotiating, maintaining a constant diplomatic relationship that required renewal through each generation's choice to participate in speaking the binding words that meant, "We are here, we are real, we share this space and request your acknowledgement." "Your grandfather's last words," the creature said, and I felt my throat tighten because I had been there, holding his hand in the hospital that smelled of disinfectant and defeat. I had thought he was delirious, rambling in the old language. That I barely spoke, clutching my wrist with surprising strength as he tried to make me repeat sounds I couldn't properly hear through my own grief and the background noise of machines measuring his departure. Now the Bigfoot spoke those same words, and with the ancestral memories unlocked inside me, I finally understood them not as goodbye, but as desperate instruction, the crucial vocabulary he had tried to pass down in the only moment he had left. The sounds weren't just words, but vibrational keys, specific pronunciations that would unlock my ability to perceive and speak with the boundaries themselves, to sense where they were failing and know instinctively what needed to be said to restore them. He had been trying to give me the fundamental tools, the basic grammar of bridge keeping, but I had heard only meaningless syllables from a dying man, had nodded and pretended comprehension to give him peace, then left the hospital without writing them down or attempting to preserve what I couldn't value because I didn't understand its purpose. The creature's massive hand swept toward the forest behind us, and suddenly I could see what my ordinary vision had never perceived. The boundaries themselves, shimmering like heat distortion in the air between the trees, but flickering, failing, shot through with spreading gaps like cracks in ancient ice. Through those gaps, I glimpsed movement that made my mind recoil. Presences that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously, their forms suggesting geometries that shouldn't function in the physical world I knew. They weren't pushing through with intent or malice. They were simply drifting toward the weakening barriers the way water seeps through deteriorating walls, following the path of least resistance as reality itself grew porous. The creature's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, yet it resonated in my chest cavity like distant thunder. This mountain was once surrounded by 7 circles of protection, renewed each generation by 7 bloodlines, speaking the words in sequence during the longest night. Its eyes held mine with an intensity that made looking away impossible. Now only fragments remain, maintained by my kind alone, and we are so diminished that we can barely hold even one full circle. The darkness you see spreading is not metaphor. It is the actual unraveling of the agreements that keep your world stable and separate from the older chaos that existed before consciousness learned to negotiate with itself. I felt something breaking open inside my chest, a grief so profound it seemed to encompass more than my individual lifetime, as if I were experiencing the accumulated sorrow of all my ancestors who had known what was being lost, but couldn't prevent it. The words my grandfather had tried to give me weren't just vocabulary. They were the last keys to a door that was swinging shut, the final possibility of restoring what generations of trauma and forced assimilation had nearly destroyed. I understood with devastating clarity that his entire life had been leading to that hospital moment, that he had preserved the knowledge through decades of silence and persecution, waiting for the right time to pass it down, only to die watching his grandson fail to receive what he was offering. The creature was showing me this not to wound me, but because I needed to understand the actual stakes, needed to feel the weight of what accepting the role of bridge keeper truly meant. This wasn't an honor or a mystical adventure. It was a crushing responsibility that would require me to carry the burden my ancestors had abandoned, to become a living bridge between worlds that most humans no longer believed existed. Every day would require the speaking of words that bound my consciousness to the mountain's failing boundaries, words that would gradually change me until I became something neither fully human nor fully part of the Guardian's realm. suspended between worlds the way the Bigfoot themselves existed, in the spaces that ordinary perception couldn't quite capture. "If you accept," the creature continued, and I heard beneath its words the hope it was trying not to show, the desperate need that it couldn't fully voice without making this coercion rather than choice. "You will live longer than ordinary humans, but you will live alone in ways that few can endure. The words will protect you, sustain you, but they will also isolate you because you will perceive layers of reality that you cannot share with those who haven't spoken the binding phrases." Through our connection, I felt the echoes of the last bridge keeper before my grandfather, a woman who had maintained her post until 1924, watching from her remote cabin as the world changed around her, as roads cut through sacred groves and dams redirected waters that had followed ancient agreements for thousands of years. She had died knowing the line would continue through my grandfather's generation, trusting that the knowledge would survive, not foreseeing the particular traumas that would convince his generation that silence was survival. The creature showed me her final days, how she had walked into the forest speaking the words continuously, pouring her remaining life force into the boundaries to give them extra decades of stability, buying time for a successor who never came. Her sacrifice had given the Guardians enough strength to maintain minimal protections until now, until this moment when the last possible bridgekeeper stood before them, trying to decide if he had the strength to accept what his bloodline had once abandoned. "The binding must be willing," the Bigfoot said, and I heard finality in those words, the acknowledgement that this was genuinely choice and not manipulation, despite the apocalyptic consequences of refusal. "If you speak the words without full commitment, they will consume you incompletely, destroying your human self without successfully creating the bridge, and both worlds will lose what little chance remains." It stepped back slightly, giving me physical space that somehow made the decision harder rather than easier, removing the pressure of its overwhelming presence so that my choice would be mine alone. I looked at my hands in the firelight, these 73-year-old hands that had held grandchildren and built ordinary houses and done ordinary work in the ordinary world that would cease to exist if the boundaries failed completely. I thought about my daughter who barely spoke our language, my grandchildren who knew our heritage as interesting history rather than living practice, the entire infrastructure of normal life that I would be abandoning to become something they would eventually stop understanding. But I also felt the weight of my grandfather's last desperate attempt to pass the knowledge forward, felt the presence of that long-ago woman who had given everything to. By time for this exact moment, felt the creature before me and its fading council of ancients who had held the boundaries alone for generations while waiting for humans to remember their part of the partnership. The words my grandfather had tried to speak weren't random syllables, I realize now. They were the beginning of the binding phrase itself, the opening that would have allowed the full transmission if I had been ready to receive it. I could feel them now, hovering just beyond my conscious memory, preserved somewhere deeper than ordinary recall in the place where blood carries knowledge across generations. The creature watched me with infinite patience as I closed my eyes and stopped trying to remember with my mind, instead feeling for the words the way you might feel for a familiar path in absolute darkness, trusting the body's memory when the eyes provide no guidance. And they came, not all at once, but syllable by syllable, rising from that deep place, like stones emerging from receding water, each one carrying weight and resonance that ordinary language never possessed. As I spoke them aloud, testing their shape in my mouth, I felt the air itself respond, felt the boundaries the creature had shown me pulse with recognition, like a dying fire suddenly receiving oxygen. These weren't words that described reality. They were words that negotiated with it, that reminded the fundamental forces of existence about agreements made so long ago that geology itself had changed since their first speaking. The Bigfoot's expression shifted into something that might have been relief or might have been sorrow, perhaps both simultaneously, as it recognized that I was beginning to understand what the words actually were. "Your grandfather knew he was dying," it said softly, and I heard in its voice the memory of watching that hospital room from somewhere beyond ordinary sight, present but unable to intervene. "He had delayed too long, hoping your generation would come to the knowledge naturally through cultural revival and renewed pride in the old ways. But the boundaries were failing faster than he anticipated, and in his final days he realized he had to force the transmission regardless of whether you were prepared. I saw it then, the impossible position my grandfather had occupied, carrying knowledge that would sound like madness if spoken plainly, waiting for a cultural moment that never quite arrived, finally attempting desperate transmission to a grandson who had spent decades away from the teachings. The words he'd spoken had been seeds planted in crisis, meant to lie dormant in my consciousness until the moment I was ready to understand what they truly meant, until I stood before the actual guardians and saw with my own eyes what generations of my family had protected. "The speaking will change you," the creature continued, its voice carrying both warning and something like apology. "Not all at once, but gradually, as your consciousness adjusts to perceiving the layers that ordinary humans edit out for sanity's sake. You will see the boundaries everywhere, will understand that what most people experience as solid reality is actually an intricate negotiation between forces that could dissolve into chaos without constant renewal." Through our connection, I felt echoes of the last bridgekeeper's experience, how she had learned to navigate between ordinary interaction with her community and the secret work of maintaining agreements that kept their world stable. She had married, raised children, participated in the surface routines of normal life, while simultaneously existing in the liminal spaces where human consciousness met the older geometries. It hadn't been two separate lives, but rather one life lived with double vision, perceiving both the consensus reality and the deeper patterns simultaneously. I would learn to do the same, the creature assured me, would develop the capacity to move through the ordinary world while speaking the words internally, maintaining the bridges without abandoning human connection entirely. I opened my eyes and looked at the ancient being before me, this survivor of a kind that had retreated from human expansion while never abandoning their sacred duty. And I understood that my choice affected not just abstract boundaries, but this actual being and whatever remained of its fading counsel. "If I speak the binding," I asked, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was accepting, "will your people finally be able to rest? Will you be released from holding the boundaries alone?" The Bigfoot's eyes held mine, and I saw in their depths a weariness that spanned centuries, the exhaustion of maintaining watch without respite or recognition. "We will never rest completely," it answered with devastating honesty, "but we will no longer be alone. The partnership was always meant to be shared, human consciousness and guardian presence working together to maintain the agreements. With your voice added to ours, the boundaries will strengthen, and perhaps others of your bloodline will hear the calling as you did." It paused, then added something that might have been the closest its kind. Came to expressing hope. Perhaps the 7 circles could eventually be restored, if enough humans remember what their ancestors once knew. I stood at the edge of the sacred grove as dawn approached, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on my shoulders, even as something ancient and powerful rose up from within my blood. The words were fully present now, no longer fragments, but a complete living structure that existed in my consciousness, like a second language I had somehow always known but never accessed. I understood with absolute clarity that once I spoke the full binding phrase, there would be no returning to the innocent half-awareness I had carried for 60 years. No. Unknowing what I was about to learn, about reality's true nature. The Bigfoot waited in patient silence, and behind it I could sense others of its kind, watching from distances beyond normal perception, the remnants of the Guardian Council holding their positions as they had done through centuries of human forgetting. My grandfather's face came to me then, not as he had been in that hospital bed fighting to transmit what I had been too distant to receive, but as he was in my earliest memories, standing in these same mountains, teaching a small boy how to listen to what the forest was actually saying beneath the obvious sounds. He had carried this burden alone for decades, and his father, before him, each generation more isolated as the culture that had once supported the bridge keepers faded into history and assimilation. Now, the responsibility was mine, and I felt simultaneously the crushing weight of what I was accepting and the rightness of it, the sense of a pattern completing itself despite all the years of disruption and forgetting. I began to speak the words, not loudly, but with absolute intention, feeling each syllable reshape the air around me in ways that had nothing to do with ordinary sound. The language moved through consonants and vowels that human throats were never quite designed for, phonemes that seemed to reach backward through time to an era when the boundaries between human and other were more permeable than they had since become. As the binding phrase unfolded, I felt the barriers between my ordinary consciousness and the deeper perception beginning to dissolve, felt my awareness expanding to include layers of reality I had spent a lifetime unconsciously ignoring. I could see them now, the boundaries the creature had shown me, not as abstractions, but as actual living structures that required constant maintenance, intricate geometries woven through the fabric of what humans called the natural world. They pulsed with the rhythm of my speaking, strengthening as the words activated agreements written into the mountain itself long before. My ancestors had crossed the land bridge into this continent. The Bigfoot's form seemed to become more solid as I spoke, as if my words were feeding its substance that had been slowly draining away through the long decades of silence. Behind it, I glimpsed the others, massive shapes holding positions at the other weakened circles, all of them, turning their attention toward this grove, as they felt the words beginning to repair what had been breaking. The final syllables left my mouth and hung in the air like visible light, and I felt something fundamental shift in my relationship to the mountains around me. The transformation the creature had warned about was already beginning, my perception deepening to include dimensions that ordinary human consciousness filtered out for the sake of manageable experience. I could feel the agreements now, not as historical artifacts, but as living negotiations that required constant renewal through speaking and intention. I understood that I would spend the rest of my life maintaining these connections, walking between the ordinary world where I was simply Thomas, an elder returned to his homeland, and this deeper reality where I served as bridge between human consciousness and the ancient guardians. The Bigfoot stepped forward and placed one massive hand on my shoulder, and through that contact I felt the gratitude and relief of beings who had held their posts for far too long without partnership. "Welcome, Bridge Keeper," it said in that voice like wind through canyons, using the title my grandfather had carried and his mother before him, reaching back through a lineage that disappeared into the mists of time before written history. The mountains remember now what was almost lost, speak the renewal with each new moon, and teach anyone who shows the capacity to hear. The 7 circles may be restored yet, if humans remember how to listen. As the dawn light finally reached the grove and the creature began to fade back into the forest depths, I felt the full weight of what I had accepted settle into my bones. I would return to the world changed, carrying knowledge that would sound like madness if spoken plainly, serving a purpose that most of my community would never comprehend. But standing there, with the first light touching the sacred trees and the words of power still resonating in my chest, I felt more complete than I had in all my decades of wandering, My grandfather's desperate transmission had found its target after all, the seeds he had planted blooming in this impossible moment of recognition and acceptance. I was the bridge keeper now, the last speaker of words that negotiated with reality itself, and through me, the ancient partnership would continue for at least one more generation. The mountains would hold because I would speak them into holding, and perhaps somewhere a child was already dreaming of forests and ancient voices, being called toward a responsibility they didn't yet understand. I gathered my camp as the morning grew bright around me, preparing to descend into the ordinary world while carrying the extraordinary knowledge that would shape the rest of my days. The creature was gone, but not absent, watching from that place beyond normal sight, no longer alone in its sacred duty. I had come home to more than just the mountains of my childhood. I had come home to a purpose that transcended individual life, connecting me to something both ancient and urgently necessary, a living bridge between what humans had become and what they had once known how to be. Would you accept a destiny that would isolate you from normal life, but save something ancient and sacred? Subscribe to hear more stories that explore the mysteries waiting just beyond the edge of our everyday awareness.